When Herbert Khaury, better known to the world as Tiny Tim, died in 1996, his eccentric life and unusual voice had already carved out a place in American pop culture. What many didn't know was that, in his final years, he had been living quietly in a modest Minneapolis home. It wasn't the kind of place one expected a celebrity to own. No sprawling mansion, no tall gates, no marble entryway. Just a small two-story house tucked on a quiet street, surrounded by maples and oaks that threw long shadows across the lawn. After his death, the house sat vacant for a few years. Neighbors swore they sometimes heard faint music at night, an old ukulele, muffled, as if strummed behind closed curtains. Eventually the house was sold, passed between a few hands, until a young couple, Mark and Elise, bought it in 2018. They weren't starstruck by the property's history. In fact, Elise admitted later she barely knew who Tiny Tim was. For them, it was just affordable and had character: arched doorways, vintage wallpaper, a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. From the beginning, however, they felt uneasy inside. On their very first night, as boxes still sat unopened in the living room, Elise said she heard someone humming upstairs. She assumed it was Mark, but when she went looking, he was outside smoking on the porch. The sound stopped the second she stepped into the hall. A week later, Mark claimed he woke to a man's whispering voice in their bedroom, so faint he couldn't make out the words, though it sounded like singing under the breath. They brushed it off at first. Old houses groan, pipes knock, wind carries sound. But then the oddities began piling up. The living room radio, which they never used, would sometimes switch itself on to an AM station that played tinny 1930s songs. Elise swore she once turned it off, left the room, and when she returned, not only was it playing again, it was tuned to static. Yet beneath the static she thought she heard someone strumming a ukulele. Mark's experiences grew darker. One night, while carrying laundry down the stairs, he felt something tug the hem of his shirt like small, deliberate fingers. When he turned, no one was there. Another time, while half asleep, he claimed he saw a tall, thin silhouette standing at the foot of their bed. He described it as awkward, almost lanky in posture, the way a man might look if his body didn't quite belong to him. Elise didn't see it, but she admitted she woke at the same moment and smelled something strange in the room: an old cologne, heavy and floral. Neighbors were the ones who finally gave them context. An older woman next door, Mrs. Capel, told Elise one afternoon, "You know he died on stage, right? He collapsed while singing. They say his spirit never left the music behind." Elise laughed it off at the time, but later that night, lying awake, she swore she heard a faint, warbling voice drifting through the air vent in their bedroom, an almost falsetto tone, humming Tiptoe Through the Tulips. They tried to live with it. They told themselves it was imagination or stress or the quirks of an old house. But the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing month. Visitors commented on the strange chill in the living room. Their dog refused to enter the upstairs hallway, barking at what appeared to be empty air. The breaking point came one evening when Mark was alone, unpacking old photo albums in the basement. He found, wedged between beams, a dust-covered box that hadn't belonged to them. Inside were scraps of paper lyrics scribbled in shaky handwriting, ticket stubs, and a faded photograph of Tiny Tim himself, smiling in a way that made Mark's stomach turn. As he lifted the photo, the basement light flickered and the radio upstairs began blasting at full volume, though it hadn't been plugged in for weeks. Mark and Elise left that night, staying with relatives, too shaken to return. They eventually put the house back on the market. The listing didn't mention the strange activity, only that the home retained its vintage charm. Neighbors say it's been sold again since then, though no family has stayed long. And still, late at night, passers-by sometimes hear faint music from the darkened windows, like a ukulele strumming on its own, accompanied by a wavering voice that seems to sing for no one at all. The house itself had a strange presence, not the kind that made you jump at sudden noises, but the quiet, lingering weight that settled into the bones of anyone who stayed too long. The walls held a kind of stillness that wasn't natural, as though sound traveled differently there. Elise noticed it the most in the evenings, when she would be cleaning the kitchen or folding laundry in the living room. No matter what she was doing, she could feel that peculiar silence pressing down, broken only by the faintest of echoes like someone humming a tune just behind her. Though she knew Mark wasn't home from work yet, the couple had begun to keep the windows open more often, trying to let fresh air sweep through the place, but it never helped. Even with the curtains blowing, the air carried a heaviness, thick with a faint sweetness, something like flowers left too long in water. Elise thought it must be mold somewhere in the walls, but when they brought in an inspector, he found nothing. He even complimented them on how well the old place had held up, remarking that it was solid, surprisingly solid for its age. Neither Mark nor Elise mentioned the other sounds, or the cold spots, or the way the dog whined if anyone tried to coax him past the base of the staircase. Mark, more skeptical by nature, tried to dismiss it all until one night he awoke to a sound so strange it rooted him to the bed. At first he thought it was the plumbing, the clatter of pipes echoing through the floorboards, but then he realized it wasn't mechanical at all. It was rhythmic like strumming, a delicate, high-pitched twang, uneven, but undeniably music, came from downstairs. He sat up, frozen, staring at the open doorway of the bedroom, listening as the faint plucking of strings was joined by a low, warbling voice. The sound was off-key, almost painful, but it carried an odd sorrow in it, as though whoever sang was trapped between wanting to comfort and being unable to reach. He didn't go downstairs that night. Instead, he shook Elise awake, whispering, asking if she could hear it too. She listened, eyes wide, and nodded. They stayed like that until dawn, the faint music drifting on and off through the dark house, never louder, never fully gone. Days passed. They tried to carry on with normal life, but neither of them could ignore the undercurrent of dread that built in the walls of the house. The small quirks of the haunting began to bleed into their routine's objects misplaced, lights flickering, a strange static crackle on their phones whenever they were inside. The living room radio, long unplugged, sat in the corner like an accusation. Elise draped a blanket over it, but still she swore she could hear its faint hiss whenever she walked past. The neighbors had begun to watch them more closely too. Mrs. Capel, the elderly woman who had first told Elise about Tiny Tim's final years, stopped by one morning to deliver a plate of muffins. Standing in the doorway, her eyes seemed to scan the house's darkened interior with unease. She didn't step inside, only handed the plate to Elise and said in a low voice, "He loved this place, you know? Spent hours in the living room with that ukulele. Said he never wanted to leave it." And then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Maybe he hasn't." That sentence stayed with Elise. It was the first time she had allowed herself to think of the disturbances as him as Tiny Tim. Until then, she had chalked it up to some nameless haunting, a restless presence without identity. Now she began to imagine him in the house, tall and strange, lingering just out of sight. The thought didn't comfort her. It filled her with a deeper unease, because it wasn't some faceless shadow anymore. It was a man who had once lived, once walked these floors, once laughed and sang in the same rooms where she now tried to sleep. Mark resisted the idea. He told Elise not to give the house a name. He said it would make it harder for them to push back against whatever was happening. But the more he tried to deny it, the more the house seemed to focus on him. He would wake with the smell of flowers thick in his nose, though there were none in the room. He once heard a burst of laughter, shrill and sharp, echoing through the hallway while he was shaving in the bathroom. And late one evening, while retrieving something from the basement, he found himself whispering "stop" out loud into the shadows, as though something unseen was standing close enough to hear. The night after that, he had the dream. In it, he was sitting in the living room chair, staring into the dark. Across from him stood a figure tall, stooped slightly, with long hair falling across its face. It held something small in its hands, and Mark realized with a sickening certainty that it was a ukulele. The figure plucked the strings, each note louder than the last, until the sound was unbearable. When Mark tried to stand, the figure's head snapped up, and its eyes wide, shining, too close together, locked on his own. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, with the faint smell of cologne still lingering in the air. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. After that dream, Mark began to dread the nights more than anything else. During the day, the house looked ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The floors creaked underfoot. The air smelled faintly of old wood. But once the sun set, the house seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves tightened around them. Even the clocks felt louder at night, each tick reverberating through the stillness until it was impossible not to notice. Elise had taken to leaving lamps on in the hallway, their glow stretching just far enough to soften the corners of the upstairs landing. Yet no matter how many lights they left burning, the shadows always seemed thicker in that house. They collected in the corners of rooms, in the bend of the staircase, and in the long hallway that led to the bedroom. The darkness there wasn't like ordinary night. It seemed to hold a depth, a weight, as though someone could be standing just inside it, watching quietly without breathing. Elise tried to occupy her mind with the house's history, perhaps as a way to rationalize what was happening. She ordered books on Tiny Tim, read old interviews, and spent hours online searching for photographs of his life. What unsettled her most was the way people described him. They called him childlike and eerie in equal measure, someone who never quite fit in, who lived on the edge of mockery and fascination. The more she read, the more she began to imagine him in their home, his tall, awkward body hunched in their living room chair, his falsetto voice floating through the kitchen where she now made coffee each morning. It was as though learning more about him allowed him to seep deeper into her thoughts, until she couldn't separate her research from the atmosphere pressing down around them. One evening, while Mark was still at work, Elise sat at the kitchen table going through a stack of old clippings she'd printed. The dog lay at her feet, restless, shifting his head from side to side. Outside, the trees rattled in the wind, their branches scraping faintly against the siding. And then, beneath that sound, she heard it so soft at first she almost ignored it. A tune. Not whistling, not quite singing, but humming in a wavering, broken falsetto. The kind of sound someone might make absent-mindedly, lost in thought. Her first instinct was to think the radio had switched on again, but when she turned toward the living room, she saw the blanket still draped across it, unmoving. The humming grew louder, drifting not from the corner but from above upstairs, near the landing where the light stretched but never seemed to fully reach. The dog's ears shot up, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Elise stood, frozen, listening as the tune wavered and broke, then started again, higher this time, like a rehearsal of a melody that couldn't be perfected. She called out just once, Mark's name, but her voice sounded thin in the air. No reply came except for the humming, which ceased all at once, cut off mid-note. When Mark came home later, she didn't tell him. She couldn't bring herself to speak it aloud, as though saying the words would make the sound return. But Mark had his own experience the following night. He'd fallen asleep on the couch with the television still flickering. Sometime after 2 in the morning, he woke to silence. The TV had gone black, though the power was still on. At first, he thought nothing of it, until he realized he wasn't alone in the room. There was movement, faint but deliberate, in the far corner. He sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The tall figure he'd dreamt of weeks before was there. Not a shadow now but something heavier, its outline distinct against the pale wallpaper. It didn't move toward him. It only stood, head tilted as though listening to something Mark couldn't hear. And then, so softly he almost doubted it, the figure whispered. Not words exactly, but fragments of sound, breath shaped into syllables without meaning. He closed his eyes, counted to 3, and when he opened them, the corner was empty. Yet the impression of being watched lingered, thick in the air, until he turned on every light in the downstairs rooms and left them burning until morning. By now, both Mark and Elise had begun to unravel in subtle ways. They spoke less, avoiding certain topics. They moved more quickly through the house, unwilling to linger in dark rooms. Elise kept fresh flowers in the kitchen, hoping their natural scent would mask the cloying perfume that seemed to drift through the rooms at night. Mark kept the basement locked, insisting it was too damp, though Elise suspected he simply didn't want to face the box he had found there. Still, the house pressed closer. Neighbors noticed Elise standing outside more often, sitting on the front steps with a blanket around her shoulders even on cold nights. One passerby later remarked that she looked haunted herself, like she didn't want to go back inside. And then came the night when the humming turned into something else entirely. It wasn't just melody now. It was singing, clear and deliberate, though muffled as if heard through a wall. The voice was unmistakably male, falsetto, carrying the odd, warbling tone that had made Tiny Tim famous. But this wasn't cheerful. It dragged, each note drawn too long, bending just enough to scrape against the ear. The words weren't distinct, only fragments that rose and fell. Yet Elise swore she heard her own name stitched faintly into the cadence, woven into the broken lines of sound. She covered her ears, whispered, "Stop, please stop." The singing faded, but in the stillness that followed she heard something worse, a shuffle of footsteps moving across the floor above her, slow and deliberate, as if someone had just crossed the bedroom while she stood below, frozen in the kitchen. The night the singing grew clear enough to form words was the night they knew they couldn't stay much longer. Elise woke to the sound first. It was after 3 in the morning, the kind of hour when the house was at its coldest, when even the air seemed thinner. She stirred from sleep, thinking she had heard someone speaking softly near the bed. But when she opened her eyes, the room was empty except for Mark, turned on his side, fast asleep. She held her breath, listening. There it was again, not speaking this time, singing, clearer than ever before, drifting through the vent at the far wall. The voice was high, falsetto, bending the notes in a way that made them waver like glass about to break. The words were unmistakable now, tiptoe, through the tulips, with me. Her heart pounded. She shook Mark awake, and as his eyes blinked open, the song faltered. For a moment the silence was total. Then, as though the singer realized it had been heard, the melody started again, louder, fuller, no longer muffled by distance but resonating right there in the room with them. Mark sat up, his face pale, listening to the impossible sound circling them. He whispered, "It's him. It's really him." And even as he said it, he looked away, ashamed to admit the thought he had resisted for so long. Elise clutched his arm. The dog, curled at the foot of the bed, lifted his head and whimpered before leaping off and scratching at the closed door, desperate to get out. The singing stopped all at once, as though cut off by a hand. For a long moment they sat frozen, waiting. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, pacing just outside in the hallway. The floorboards groaned with each deliberate step, back and forth, back and forth. Mark stood, his voice shaking, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. Yet the footsteps continued, circling the upstairs landing in a loop that didn't stop, as though someone was trapped in the act of walking forever. Mark stepped out, calling into the shadows, "Stop it! You're not welcome here." His words echoed, but the footsteps carried on, indifferent. He slammed the door shut, and only then did they cease. Neither of them slept again that night. The following evening, Elise tried something she never thought she would do. She sat in the living room with the lights off, the radio still covered, and spoke aloud into the silence. "Herbert," she said softly, using his real name, "you don't have to stay here anymore. This isn't your home now. Please let go." Her voice cracked on the last words. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, faintly, she heard the sound of strings being plucked, 1, 2, 3 notes, soft and hesitant, like a reply. She covered her face with her hands, trembling. That night, the dream returned to Mark. He was back in the chair in the living room, the tall figure before him, its face half hidden by hair. Only this time, the figure didn't strum the ukulele. It simply stood there, swaying slightly, its head tilted to one side. When it lifted its face, the eyes were impossibly wide, unblinking, reflecting the dim glow of a light that wasn't really there. The figure opened its mouth and sang, but no sound came out. The silence was worse than the music. Mark woke with a scream, his chest aching as though something heavy had been pressing down on him in his sleep. The decision to leave came the next morning. They didn't speak it out loud at first, but they both knew. Elise packed boxes without comment. Mark carried them to the car in silence. Even the dog seemed relieved, pacing the doorway as though he understood they were finally escaping. They stayed with friends until they could arrange to sell. The house didn't take long to find a buyer on paper. It was still charming, still a piece of celebrity history, still affordable for its size. They said nothing of what they had endured. They only handed over the keys and never looked back. But neighbors say the new owners didn't last. Within months, the lights were dark again, the curtains drawn. Some nights, people walking past claim they hear the faint plucking of strings, or a broken falsetto voice rising through the stillness. Others swear they've seen a tall, thin silhouette through the upstairs window, swaying gently in the dark as though listening to music no one else can hear. And the house remains ordinary in daylight, but after dark it carries with it the strange echo of a man who lived too fully in his oddness, who died on stage with music still in his throat, and who seems unwilling or unable to tiptoe away into silence. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.